Let's get started on building the jukebox. The major manufacturers laminate these jukeboxes up out of multiple thin sheets and they place them in a large press. Then they add the front and the back. On the regular jukeboxes, the front is usually hinged and the back is as well. On mine, it's going to be stationary. I'm going to build the jukebox in two sections. I'm going to build the lower base, and then I'm going to build the domed half on top, and I'm going to bolt them both together. In terms of the wood, I'm going to build most of it out of 3/4 inch sharp grade birch because I'm going to be veneering it with some cherry veneer. The front, however, I'm doing out of 3/4 inch MDF. I wanted it nice and smooth so that I could add a vinyl decal to it, and also where the windows are for the computer monitor and for the receiver, you're going to see the edges. I didn't want to look at the edges of the plywood. The first thing I did was I made a template out of 1/4 inch MDF. The template was going to represent the front panel of the jukebox, and it would have 3 openings: the opening for the speakers, the opening for the receiver, and the opening for the 22-inch monitor. Once I got that all squared away, I would then use a trim bit on my router to cut the piece of 3/4 inch MDF, and the edges would be nice and smooth. Once I had the front panel cut out, I had to figure out how to make the curved acrylic panels for the corners. I first started with a piece of acrylic tubing which was about 4 inches in diameter. My plan was to cut it vertically, create 2 halves, and use them on each half. I didn't like the way that looked. I wanted to replicate the look of the Whirliter jukebox, so I decided to melt those down and see if I could form them into a corner that would be the correct size. Fortunately, this cast acrylic is very easy to melt and mold. I did some calculations and some trial and error, and I determined that if I could create a curve around an 8-inch diameter circle, it would give me the shape and contour that I was looking for. So I went to the big box store and I bought an 8-inch sonotube. Those are the cardboard cylindrical tubes people use to pour concrete for footings on decks. It had the exact contour I was looking for. I figured if I could heat up the acrylic plastic and place it on that, it would give me an appropriate contour. Heating up the plastic took some trial and error. The goal is to bring it up to about 325 degrees for about 12 or 13 minutes, and it has the correct flexibility and malleability to mold it. Unfortunately, the side panels of acrylic were going to be wider than my indoor oven, so I tried to use my outdoor grill to heat them up. This turned out to be a disaster as the heat was very uneven and some of the plaster blistered up. I therefore ultimately ended up moving indoors and doing it inside my oven. I figured out a way that you can heat a longer piece of acrylic than the longest inside dimension of the oven, and I'll show you that later. But for right now, I was able to get a couple of pieces molded. They weren't perfect, but I was able to get them cut and molded so I could determine their size and I could move forward with building the plywood enclosure. So once I heated up the acrylic, it became soft and flexible. I was able to take it over to the sonotube and drape it over the sonotube. It sets up pretty quickly. Within a minute or two, it's firm. So I Add a pair of gloves on as it's pretty hot. I held it on the sonotube, and after a while I ended up with two pieces, one for each side of the jukebox. These actually ended up being scrap pieces, and I did not use them as the color was way off. But it gave me the opportunity to learn how to handle and bend this plastic. There is a slight learning curve to this. You can see over here the two pieces that are molded in my workshop. These are the test pieces I would use to measure the side and the front so that they joined with these on an angle in the corner. What I would ultimately do is create a rabbet on the front panel, a rabbet on the side panel, approximately the thickness of the plexiglass, which was 1/8, and I would screw these into the side and front, and they would ultimately be covered up with molding. You can see here I cut a small cross-sectional piece, and this became my template. This is the piece of curved molded plexiglass, 1/8 inch thick, sitting in the rabbet on the side. And you'll see in a moment where it joins the front. It forms a nice corner, which would be screwed in with small woodworking screws and then ultimately covered over with a piece of molding. I now got going on cutting out the shelves and cutting out the panels. I cut the openings for the electrical outlet as well as the ventilation fans. To cut out all the pieces, I cut out the bottom shelf, to which I attached some casters. I cut out the middle shelf and I cut out the top shelf. I put dados in the sides so that it would line up, and I cut holes in the shelves and also the back to accommodate computer fans and the power outlets. After I cut the holes for the fans and the notches for the cable management, I hit them with a round over bit and dry fit the case together in preparation for the final assembly. After dry fitting it, I recruited my wife and we assembled it. I used tight bond glue, a brad nailer, and then I clamped it up overnight. The clamps gave it a light sanding and then proceeded to build the domed top portion of the jukebox. I used a circle cutting jig on my router to cut out the arches for the top of the jukebox. Once I made one, I could use it as a template and take it over to my router table with a pattern bit and cut more of them. This is the bottom of the top piece, the dome. You can see that I put T-nuts. Originally my plan was to make the jukebox so it could be broken down into two pieces for transportation. But then as I moved along and finished it, the top and bottom became too integrated with all the wiring, so I just left it completely as one piece. I then proceeded to use brads and glue and clamping to assemble the arch pieces. I made the main arch 1.5 inches smaller than the sides to accommodate 2 layers of 3/8 inch plywood that I would apply over the top. Also, you can see the small arch that attaches above the front panel had a rabbet in it, and I used my sample piece of plastic to make sure that the plastic mold that I was about to make would accommodate the acrylic sheet that I would mold. Template piece of cut acrylic, and I confirmed that the top and also the side areas were the appropriate size to accommodate the plastic. I got my liquid nails out to be able to attach the top on. There's a couple of different products you can use to apply over the curved arches. They make an MDF product that comes pre-curved on the back and is easily bendable. They also make a wood they sometimes call wacky wood or wiggle board, which is what I used. It's a Lawan plywood that's incredibly flexible. It's not very stiff, so you have to put a couple of layers down to get the appropriate stiffness. I stapled it down after putting down some liquid nails and then glued another sheet on top. You can see it here. It's bent in front of my table saw. You can usually pick this up at most plywood supply houses. I think it was about $35 a sheet for a 4x8 sheet. After I got the first layer down, I coated it with Titebond glue, and then I added a second layer. I held it back in the front a little bit to create a rabbet to accommodate the plastic lens that I was going to mold. Here's the assembled product. If you look on the bottom shelf, you'll see a couple of pieces of 3/4 inch MDF. Those are going behind the cutout for the speaker so that the ultimate front of the acoustical fabric will be set in a couple of inches, and I'm going to run a strip of LED above it. I needed to create a mechanism to support the LED strip that was going to start on one side, run up over the top continuously down to the other side. So I fashioned these small boxes out of 1/2 inch Baltic birch. I made them so they're removable in case I had to replace the LED strip down the road. I attached them from the inside with wood screws. Eventually I'd paint these white on the outside and attach the LED strips to them. I wanted to keep the LED strip far enough back from the front of the lens to give me a good distribution of the light. Originally I was going to use kind of a translucent, frosted looking acrylic plastic, but when I tried it, you could see the LEDs right through it. It didn't give you a good distribution, so I experimented around with some different colors, and I found out the best one to use was an almond colored acrylic. I picked it up on eBay. You can buy it in 2x4 foot sheets, and it gave a really nice distribution of light. I went ahead and gave it a coat of paint. White where the LED was going, and black where the vinyl graphic was going. I used an oil-based paint on the front and sanded it down smooth before applying the graphic. I also gave the back a coat of paint, and I put some clear water-based poly on the inside and installed the fans. In order to mold the two curved pieces at the top of the jukebox, I had to build a hydraulic press. I started off by cutting a number of circles that were 8 inches in diameter, because that was the curve of the ultimate final contour. I then went over to the chop saw and cut them up into quarter pieces. I took those quarter pieces and I used them with some plywood and some remaining wiggle wood to create a convex contour. I then had to smooth out this contour, so I applied some joint compound to it after I had it all glued up, and I put some joint tape on it. I thought that would be firm enough for me to be able to use it. Then I began sanding it down to get a nice smooth finish. I was concerned after a while that it might not be hard enough, so when I did the mating piece, the concave piece, I decided to use automotive Bondo instead. I figured if the plaster was too soft, I could always sand it off and then replace it with the Bondo. The Bondo's pretty difficult to sand though. As it turned out, it didn't matter whether it was the plaster or the Bondo. It provided a nice mold to work with. So here's the concave part being built. Again, I cut a series of these out. I arranged them, stapled them and glued them, put down some joint tape, but this time used automotive Bondo filler instead. I then created a couple of sanding blocks that were the exact profile of the concave and the convex portions. And once everything hardened, I was able to sand these down so that they mated pretty well. Here you can see the concave piece with the sanding block. It took a lot longer to sand the Bondo than it did the joint compound, that's for sure. Ultimately, though, I got both pieces finished and they fit together pretty well, and I was ready to build the hydraulic press. This is the start of it. To make the press, I used some scrap lumber I had. I put some T-nuts on the bottom, and I used 3/8" threaded rod to form my alignment poles on each side to keep the top and bottom in alignment. Here's the press in the closed position. You'll notice there's a space below the bottom, and that's to slip in an automotive floor jack, and I would clamp the bottom portion up against the top. The top would be fixed with some nuts. Here it is in the open position. Threaded rods, because when I went to slide the hot piece of acrylic plastic in here, it was a little sketchy putting it in. It worked out okay, but if I did it again, I'd use longer rods. The trick on getting a long piece of acrylic into your oven is to bend it in half and place it over a form. So what I did was I took my long piece of acrylic that I cut. These are for the two side pieces of the jukebox. Also, be mindful that this stuff does shrink a little bit as you heat it up. I'd say a 2.5" piece shrinks about maybe 3/16 of an inch in width, so you have to overcut it and then trim it down on the table saw. Anyway, once it gets soft and flexible, you can take it out. You can see how malleable it is. Place it over the form and just drape it there. It comes out pretty hot, so make sure you have some gloves on. And it sets up remarkably fast, probably in about a minute or so, and it would be completely firm. The nice thing about it is that if you make a mistake and it doesn't come out perfect, you can just put it back in the oven and reheat it again. Here we are molding the pieces that are curved. If I did this again, I'd probably make the jig a little bit wider to give me more room, and I'd probably make the rods a little bit taller. Once the piece of plastic got very soft and malleable, I just slid it in from the back. My wife kind of guided me, and then we lifted up the hydraulic jack. The hydraulic jack puts a tremendous amount of force on this, and you really get a good mold. I was concerned that every little imperfection in the mold would show up, but that was not the case. They came out nice and smooth. The trick is to cut the sheet of acrylic big. I did some experimentation with a piece of cloth first to find out how big to make it. Then I cut the acrylic out with a jigsaw and heated it up. You want it to overlap on all four sides. And once it's cooled down and firm, I took it down to the bandsaw. I rough cut it, and then I went over to my stationary sander and finish sanded the edges so that it fit exactly how I wanted it to fit on the jukebox. I did this for the two curved pieces on the top and also for the center red piece on the top. You can see as you take this off, that piece of plastic is nice and firm. And again, if it doesn't come out right, you can just pop it back into the oven, reheat it, and then remold it. I had to do this several times to get the technique down, but once you get it down, it works pretty well. Here's the pieces on my workbench. And you can see where I roughed through the lines that I'm going to go over to the bandsaw and cut them down. The red lines are more where the finish lines are, and I'll sand down to those and test fit it as I go. If there's a small defect in one of the edges of the corners, you can put a heat gun on it and you can actually mold these a little bit, so there is a little bit of adjustability with these. I did the red pieces as well and then test fit them against the case. At this point, I wanted to apply the graphic. I have to give a shout out to my son-in-law, Craig, who designed this for me. I wanted something that characterized 1950s rock and roll, kind of a tribute to Americana rock and roll. So he created this graphic. I had it printed at a local print shop and had it laminated. They put a thin clear piece of plastic on top of it, and then I applied it to the front of the jukebox. I wanted to get it on before I added all the moldings. Also, you can see the speaker is recessed back in. I did that so I could run an LED above it and illuminate it. I got a couple of two-way speakers on Amazon and built a small box enclosure to have the speakers in. I covered the front of it with acoustic fabric, and I stuffed some fiberglass batting inside the case and then attached the back. I have a couple of terminals on the back so I can just plug in the connectors from the receiver. Next, I took some 4/4 cherry for the legs. I milled them down, and then I put a series of dado cuts in them to add some detail. After I made the dado cuts, I then took them down and ripped them into pieces, rounded the edges on the router table, and glued them to some canvas to create a tambour type effect. Then I stained them and hit them with some shellac. I was now ready to install the LEDs. I decided to use cob LEDs because they have the highest density of LEDs per meter, and they give you the most uniform transitions. I picked them up on Amazon. A little word about LEDs. You kind of get what you pay for with these LEDs, so I would not get the cheapest brand I could find. I think these cost me maybe $30. And as far as controlling them, I bought a WLED controller. WLED, if you're not familiar with it, is an open source controlling program. You can build your own controller, or you can buy them for about $35 on Amazon. I bought mine. You put the app on your phone and you can change all the effects and transitions and colors. It's pretty remarkable. And again, I bought 12-volt LEDs so that I could use the same transformer I was using for my cooling fans. It's important not to rely upon the adhesive strip that comes on the back of these LED strips. My experience is that it deteriorates over time and they become loose, so I reinforced it with these plastic clips I picked up on Amazon. Once I had the LEDs attached, I attached all the plastic. You want to make sure you slowly pre-drill these because this plastic can crack. And then once you have it drilled, use a countersinking bit to create plenty of room for the screw. Once I had all the plastics drilled, I attached them. I checked the LEDs. Don't worry if you don't get a perfect union of these or they don't join the cabinetry precisely, because you're going to be applying moldings everywhere. You're going to be applying moldings where the red and cream colored plastic meet, and also where the plastic meets the wood. I applied the veneer in 3 pieces, the 2 sides and the dome top piece. And where they joined on the side, I'm going to have a piece of decorative molding running to camouflage it. It was now ready for some stain. I applied some dark walnut stain and covered it with several coats of shellac. I ended up knocking down the shine a little bit on the shellac with some 4-0 steel wool. I wanted to replicate the look of the Wurlitzer Jukebox base, which is kind of a chrome looking base, and there's these round structures that go around the wheels. I ended up hunting around Home Depot and I found this 8-inch black plastic pipe, which I bought. I cut a section off and slotted it. I had to put the slots in it because the wheels were hitting it. And then I took some 1/4-inch MDF board and made the pieces that go in between the 2 round areas. I then took the rounded black areas and attached them to the underside of the case. And this left plenty of room for the wheels to turn. You can see it in this photo. And I also have the pieces that are going on the front and along the sides. I masked off the area and then hit them with some primer. Once the primer was dry, I sprayed them with some Rust-Oleum chrome paint. What I use for the moldings on the upper part of the jukebox as well. The only thing I notice is that even though it dries to the touch in about a day or so, it doesn't really cure for several days. It remains kind of soft, so you have to be careful when you're handling it, otherwise it picks up fingerprints. This is also the paint I used on the speaker grill. While I had the jukebox on its back on a couple of sawhorses, I took the opportunity to take some red cob LEDs and run a strip along the bottom to give it a little glow underneath. For the speaker grill, I sort of eyeballed it. I left a provision in the center for a light, and I'm going to have an emblem made and put on top of it. I cut it out of paper. I transferred it over to 1/4-inch MDF from which I cut it out. It would have been a lot easier if I had a scroll saw, but I didn't have one, so I ended up just using a handheld jigsaw to cut it out. I've since acquired a classic Delta scroll saw, which I'm in the process of restoring. A little late for this project, though. I cut the center hole out first on my drill press, and I'll show you how I mount a little light on the back of that. Here's a little light source that I made using a tin can. I cut the can back. I put some small little flanges on it so I could glue it to a piece of acrylic. And then I ran some of the Cobb LED on the inside. Here's a video of it. Once I had it sanded and primed, I gave it a coat of the Rust-Oleum chrome paint. I found out, however, the MDF is very absorbent and it just kept sucking up paint. So I decided to give it a coat of gesso, which is an acrylic product. And once I did that, it took a coat beautifully. Here's what the light looks like illuminated. There's two LED sources here, one up along the top that I inserted in a dado that I made when I was building it, and that round one on the can you can see. I'm getting an emblem for that. Now I started working on the moldings that were going to be going on both sides where the red plastic met the almond colored plastic. There's 3 on each side and they run along the back on each sides. I decided to make these out of poplar. So I cut out 6 of them, and the first thing I did was go over to the router table and routed the 3 grooves on each side of them. Then I locked them in a vise and I started carving them to create the pattern that you see on many of the jukeboxes. And with a little bit of time, a little bit of sanding, a little bit of carving, I was able to come up with this design. I pre-drilled them so I could then attach them to the jukebox. Prior to painting, I sanded them down and then I coated them with gesso. It gives it a much smoother finish and the paint dries to more of a chrome-like finish. Again, I used the same paint I had used before, the Rust-Oleum chrome colored paint, and they looked pretty good. I also ran some long strips that I was going to run along the side, and I painted those as well. Then I cut out and carved the small seashell looking pieces that go on the sides. Once I had them all carved and sanded, I gave them a coat of the gesso material to smooth them out, and then I gave them a quick spray with the Rust-Oleum chrome paint, and I hot glued these guys onto the red side pieces. Next, I started working on the 2 decorative pieces of molding that go up over the top of the jukebox at the 11 o'clock and 1 o'clock position. First, I took some pieces of 1 1/4 inch poplar and glued them up and roughed them out on the bandsaw. Then I created a tenon on each end so that I could mount a horizontal piece, a perpendicular piece. You need to do this because the grain has to go perpendicular to the vertical grain. Once I had them sort of roughed out, I went over to the sander and began smoothing them down. They ended up being about 3/4 of an inch thick. Then I glued some pieces perpendicular to the main piece. It's sort of a half-lap joint. Once that was done, I sketched out the appearance of how I wanted to carve it. I next laid out the carving and used a combination of different carving tools, some carving gouges, knives, Dremel tools, sanders, whatever, to carve the two units that went up on the top of the jukebox. After they were carved, I gave them a coat of gesso and then gave them a coat of spray paint with the Rust-Oleum chrome paint. Then I attached them to the jukebox with some brad nails and some screws. Finally, I had to make a few doors for the unit. The rear door was made out of 3/4 inch plywood. I used a piano hinge to attach it. And since I had the subwoofer on the bottom shelf, I put a small metal panel in to help with the sound transmission. I cut a slot for the handle as well. I had to mold a small piece of plastic to place on the inside of the curve on the jukebox behind the semicircular door. I built a frame and heated up the plastic and placed it on it. Yeah. Then I trimmed it to size, brought it over, and inserted it. I used a little hot glue and a single screw to keep it in position. To build a semicircular door that was in front of the turntable, I turned to my router and my circle cutting jig. I cut a circle out of 1/4 inch MDF, and this acted as a template to make the door, which was going to be made out of 3/4 MDF. Once I got the template made, I used some double-sided tape, and I taped it down to a piece of 3/4 inch MDF and brought it over to the router table where I made a copy of it. Before I painted it black, I put a little rabbit on the inside to accommodate a piece of glass. I brought it down to my local glass shop. They were able to cut the piece of glass, and then I used those plastic clips. I attached a piano hinge and attached it to the jukebox. I found this black rubber or plastic molding on Amazon. It has an adhesive back to it, and it worked out perfectly because it would go up the side where the plastic met the wood on the jukebox, and I could carry it up over the top. It conceals the area where the screws are. In addition, I bought some 3/8 inch red plastic tubing, also on eBay, and I was able to cut that and bend it and use a little hot glue to glue it on the edge where the molding met the plastic. It's a little reminiscent of the bubbler tubes that were on the original Wurlitzer. To line up with the rubber black molding for the front. Painted it black and attached it with a few brad nails. On top of that, I then placed a curved piece of the red plastic rod. I then installed the door, and I was able to locate one of these small vintage stickers on eBay from a seller in England. Here's a view of the completed jukebox. In the back you can see the wiring. The receiver's on top, and on the bottom is the power supply with the distribution block and the WLED controller. Touch latch over here, and the karaoke microphones and the karaoke mixer with the turntable behind it. I installed this smoked glass pivot door just to conceal the receiver. The IR remote does work through that. It looks a little sleeker looking. And here's a view of the finished product. Well, thanks for watching, and if you have any questions or comments, please feel free to leave them below and I'll try to get to them. Thanks again and have a great day.
1, 2, 3.